Dana Reeves was escorted out of St. Clement's Hospital for the third time at 11:47 at night, and she walked back in through the emergency entrance at 11:52. The security guard at the main ICU corridor had been polite about it the first time, firm about it the second time, and genuinely tired about it the third. A large man named Gerald, whose name she'd read from his badge on her first pass, who had positioned himself between her and the elevator bank with the weary authority of someone who had been told from above that the woman with the research credentials and the increasingly insistent questions about the blood work on Marcus Cole was not to reach the fourth floor under any circumstances. "You understand I'm not a visitor," Dana said on the third attempt, standing in the fluorescent hallway of the ICU corridor with her laptop bag over one shoulder and the printed trial documentation under her arm, the antiseptic smell of the hospital pressing against her from every direction, the distant sound of monitors and the low, professional urgency of critical care staff filling the corridor behind Gerald's considerable frame. "I have a contract with Cole Holdings. I'm employed by the organization whose principal is dying on the fourth floor of this building." "You don't have clearance for the fourth floor," Gerald said. "Dr. Walsh doesn't have the authority to revoke my hospital access," Dana said. "He's a treating physician. He's not in administration." "Administration confirmed it," Gerald said. "Twice tonight." "Administration confirmed what Dr. Walsh told them to confirm," Dana said. "That's a different thing." She turned and walked back toward the main entrance, because the emergency entrance was around the side of the building and she needed to be moving before Gerald contacted security again. She had recognized the compound in Marcus Cole's blood work 4 hours ago, in the third-floor research office she occupied under her pharmaceutical contract audit, when one of the Cole Holdings associates, a man named Reyes who had been moving through the building since Marcus's admission with the specific controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis from outside its center, had mentioned in the hallway the presenting symptoms to someone on his phone. She had been walking past. She had stopped. She had spent 3 years in a pharmaceutical trial studying a synthetic compound called Verantix 9, which the trial's lead scientist had developed as a controlled immunosuppressant and which had been quietly shelved when the trial's pharmaceutical sponsor realized that the compound's most significant side effect, a cascade organ failure that presented identically to natural multi-organ dysfunction, made it an extraordinarily effective and forensically invisible method of homicide. She had written the trial's research summary. She had flagged the concern in the summary. The summary had been buried by Dr. Raymond Walsh, who served on the sponsor's clinical advisory board and who was, as of tonight, Marcus Cole's attending physician. She had understood the shape of what was happening before she reached the fourth floor on her first attempt. The emergency entrance was unmanned at this hour, accessible with a basic hospital ID that she still possessed because Gerald had physically escorted her out of the building, but no one had administratively revoked her badge yet, which was the specific, bureaucratic gap that someone moving fast enough could use. And Dana Reeves had been moving fast since 11:14. She took the emergency stairwell to the fourth floor and emerged into the ICU corridor from the opposite end from Gerald's position. The room Marcus Cole was in was the third on the left. She knew this because she'd been in the corridor twice already tonight and had an excellent memory for spatial layout. She knocked twice, opened the door without waiting and stepped inside. The room was occupied by 2 men, one of them unconscious in the hospital bed, attached to monitoring equipment whose readouts she scanned immediately and automatically from the doorway, and one of them standing near the window who was not medical staff and who turned toward her with the specific, measuring attention of someone whose profession required them to assess threats rapidly. "Close the door," Dana said to the man by the window. "I have approximately 4 minutes before security realizes which entrance I used. I need to tell you what's actually in his blood work and why the physician treating him is the reason he's dying." The man by the window did not move for approximately 2 seconds. Then he closed the door. "Who are you?" he said. "Dana Reeves," she said. "I'm the pharmaceutical contract auditor for Cole Holdings. 3 hours ago I heard someone in the hallway describe Mr. Cole's presenting symptoms and I recognized a compound called Verantix 9, which I spent 3 years studying in a clinical trial that Dr. Walsh helped bury specifically because of what it was capable of. He knows exactly what's in Mr. Cole's blood work. He also knows that there is a counteragent protocol that the trial developed before it was shelved, and he has told your people it does not exist." She put the trial documentation on the bedside table. The counteragent exists, she said. I have the protocol. I have the trial documentation. I have Walsh's name on the advisory board that buried the trial. And I have approximately 22 hours before the compound's cascade progression reaches the point where the counteragent no longer works. The man by the window looked at the documentation on the table. He looked at the man in the bed. He looked at Dana Reeves, standing in an ICU room she had been removed from twice and had returned to through a service stairwell, with printed research documentation and the specific focused calm of someone who had made a decision before she got on the elevator. "Who else have you told?" he said. "No one," Dana said. "I was trying to get to this room for 3 hours. This was the first available moment." "My name is Reyes," he said. "I know," Dana said. "I heard you in the hallway." Behind her, from somewhere down the corridor, she heard Gerald's voice, and the particular resigned urgency of a security professional who had realized the gap he'd left. She had approximately 90 seconds. Dana Reeves had spent 11 years being the most accurate person in any room she entered and the least consulted person in the same room, which she had come to understand was not a contradiction but a system. The specific, self-reinforcing logic of institutions that asked for credentials and then assigned weight to the credentials they'd already decided mattered. She had a master's degree in pharmaceutical research and 3 years of fieldwork in clinical trial analysis, all of it accumulated through the specific nonlinear path of someone who'd funded her own education through a combination of part-time work and research contracts, who had not come out of the right programs or with the right mentors' names on her CV, and who had spent her career doing the kind of thorough, unglamorous research work that produced results nobody wanted to credit to a source they hadn't anticipated. She was 34. She had published 4 papers, all in journals that were respected within their specific fields and unknown outside them. She had been hired by Cole Holdings 6 months ago through a contract referral from a compliance attorney who had appreciated her work on a pharmaceutical liability review, and she had been operating in the building's third-floor research space for that entire period without once being invited to a meeting that mattered. She had also, across those 6 months, been tracking a pattern in the pharmaceutical contracts she was auditing that had not been part of her original brief. A series of regulatory submissions across 3 of Cole Holdings' subsidiary holdings that referenced a clinical trial, Verantix 9, which had been listed as concluded and archived, and which appeared in the regulatory documentation with a level of thoroughness that was inconsistent with a trial that had simply run its course and been filed away. Concluded trials didn't get referenced in regulatory submissions 4 years after their closure unless someone was managing their visibility. She had pulled the trial's original documentation through academic database access she maintained through an ongoing institutional affiliation, and she had spent 6 weeks reading it in the evenings, adding annotations to the printed pages in the mechanical pencil she used for everything. A cheap aluminum-bodied tool she'd carried since graduate school, whose weight in her hand was the same comfortable constant it had always been, which she pressed to her lips when she was thinking through something that required more than one pass. She had not known what she was going to do with the Verantix 9 documentation before tonight. She had understood it was significant. She had understood Walsh's name on the advisory board was a connection worth flagging to someone. She had not understood, until she heard Reyes in the hallway describing Marcus Cole's presenting symptoms, that the significance she'd been sitting on was operating on a countdown. "Walsh knows exactly what's in the blood work," she said in the ACU room to Reyes, with Gerald's voice now audible in the corridor. "He participated in developing the compound. He knows the counteragent protocol exists. He buried the trial specifically because the compound's effects were too recognizable to anyone who'd been inside the trial." "Too recognizable to you," Reyes said. "To anyone who'd read the research," Dana said. "I'm not the only person who was in that trial. I'm the only one in this building tonight." Gerald was at the door. The knock was firm and official. "Take the documentation," Dana said. "Everything I've told you is in it. The counteragent protocol is in the appendix, page 41. You need to reach Dr. Miriam Park, who was the trial's lead scientist. She's at the University of Westfield Medical Research Institute. She will confirm everything I've told you and she will provide the protocol synthesis guidance Walsh claims doesn't exist." "What are you going to do?" Reyes said. "I'm going to open the door," Dana said. "And I'm going to get escorted out again." And then I'm going to call Dr. Park myself because I still have my phone and Walsh can't do anything about that from inside this hospital. She opened the door. Gerald and a second security officer she hadn't met yet were both present. "Miss Reeves," Gerald said with the specific tired resignation of a man encountering a situation that exceeded the parameters of his job description. "I'm leaving voluntarily," Dana said. "I don't need to be escorted." "I'm required to escort you," Gerald said. "Then let's go," Dana said. She went. She looked at Reyes once as she moved into the corridor, a look that communicated two things precisely: that she had said everything she needed to say, and that the next move belonged to him. He was looking at the documentation. She could not tell from his expression whether he was reading it or deciding whether to read it. She could only tell that he had it and that what she'd said was accurate, and that the counteragent protocol on page 41 was complete enough for a qualified physician to execute if someone put it in front of them in the next 22 hours. She walked through the corridor beside Gerald and into the elevator and through the hospital's main lobby, and she was on the sidewalk in the cold night air outside St. Clement's at 12:17 in the morning, with her laptop bag and her mechanical pencil and her phone, and she was calling Dr. Miriam Park before the hospital's glass doors had fully closed behind her. It rang 4 times before Park answered, groggy and then immediately alert the moment Dana said the words Varantics, 9 and Walsh and tonight. "Tell me exactly what's happening," Park said. Dana told her. Precisely and in sequence and without softening any of it. Marcus Cole did not become aware of Dana Reeves until he regained consciousness 31 hours after her first attempt to reach his hospital room, and by that point she had already changed the outcome of everything. He came back slowly, the way people came back from the specific systematic damage that Varantics 9 produced when reversed by the counteragent. Not all at once, but in stages, each stage more coherent than the previous one, the monitoring equipment sounds clarifying from abstract noise into specific information. The first thing he registered with full coherence was Reyes, seated in the chair beside the bed with the specific relieved exhaustion of a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was refusing to acknowledge it. "What happened?" Marcus said. His voice was rough. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint residual smell of the counteragent synthesis that had been administered in this room. A specific faintly chemical smell he could not have identified but that his body apparently registered as relevant. "Walsh happened," Reyes said. "And then someone else happened. In that order." He gave Marcus the account over the next hour. The admission, the diagnosis, the 24-hour prognosis. And the woman who had been escorted out of the building 3 times and had still managed to produce the documentation that saved his life. He described Dana Reeves with the specific practical precision of a man who had assessed her that night under conditions of extreme time pressure and had formed an accurate opinion quickly. He described the trial documentation, Walsh's advisory board connection, the counteragent protocol on page 41, and the conversation with Dr. Miriam Park that had happened while Dana was standing on the sidewalk in the cold and Reyes was reading the appendix in Marcus's room. He described the administration of the counteragent, with Dr. Park providing remote guidance and a hospital pharmacist who had been reached at home at 1 in the morning and who had understood from the documentation Park transmitted that the protocol was legitimate. He described Walsh attempting to intervene, the hospital's night administrator reaching the attending team, the 3-hour window during which Dana Reeves's documentation was the entire basis for a medical decision that flew against everything the building's most decorated physician had officially stated. "She was right," Marcus said. "She was precisely right," Reyes said. Walsh's diagnosis was not a mistake. This landed in the room with the weight that truths of that particular shape always carried. Not surprise exactly, because Marcus had built his survival on the principle that certain categories of threat required no surprise, only response. But wait. The specific weight of understanding that someone had walked a misdiagnosis into his hospital room and let him in. "Who is she?" Marcus said. Reyes gave him the professional summary. The pharmaceutical audit contract, the 6 months in the third-floor research space, the Varantics 9 trial work, the institutional affiliation that maintained her database access. Marcus listened with the same kind of methodical attention he gave to information that was going to be relevant to subsequent decisions. "She's still employed," he said. "The contract wasn't terminated," Reyes said. Walsh tried. Administration pushed back when the counteragent situation became documented. "There's an active review process." "Cancel the review," Marcus said. Expand her contract. To what scope? Reyes said. Whatever scope she tells you she needs, Marcus said. And bring her up when she arrives today. He said this with the flat certainty of a man who had made a decision and expected it to be executed, and Reyes, who had worked alongside Marcus for 9 years and had a very accurate understanding of when Marcus's certainties were worth debating and when they were not, wrote it down and moved on. Dana arrived at the hospital at 8:15 that morning, which was when her standard working hours began, and which told Marcus, when Reyes reported it, something specific about how she operated, that she came in at the same time regardless of what the previous night had contained, because her work was the work and the hours were the hours and the previous night was the previous night. Marcus was sitting up in the hospital bed when Reyes brought her in, which had required a significant argument with the nursing staff and which Marcus had won because he was alive and oriented and because the counteragent had done what the protocol said it would do. Dana Reeves came through the door with her laptop bag and the mechanical pencil tucked behind her left ear and the specific matter-of-fact quality of someone arriving for a meeting rather than a significant personal encounter. Mr. Cole, she said. You were escorted out 3 times, Marcus said. She said. The 4th one was by phone after I left voluntarily. The administration called to formally revoke my building access at 1 in the morning. I told them I was already on the sidewalk and their timing was poor. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Sit down, he said. She sat. Walk me through Walsh, he said. From the beginning. Not what you've already given Reyes, your full analysis. What you found when you found it and what you understood at each stage. She walked him through it. She did it in the precise, sequential way of someone who had organized the information in her mind before she spoke it, which meant she didn't revise mid-sentence or circle back to add things she'd forgotten, which meant the account was as complete at the end as it was going to be and he could ask questions from a position of actual understanding. Yes, 6. She answered each one with the same directness she'd brought to everything else. At the end, he said, You recognize the compound from a hallway conversation. 3 specific symptoms in combination, Dana said. It's a recognizable pattern if you know the trial. Walsh knew it too. That's the difference, Marcus said, between knowledge that gets used and knowledge that gets paid not to be. Some debts are paid in silence, Dana said. Walsh spent 4 years collecting on that one. Marcus looked at her with the same kind of assessment he'd given to every relevant fact in the past 2 days. What he found in the assessment was consistent with what Reyes had told him. Someone operating at a level of competence and integrity that the institution she'd been working inside for 6 months had systematically failed to account for. That failure was going to be corrected. But first Walsh needed to be handled, and handling Walsh required understanding everything Dana knew about the trial, the compound, and the network of connections Walsh had been protecting for 4 years. How much do you have documented? Marcus said. Everything I told Reyes, Dana said, plus 3 months of additional analysis I'd been doing on the Verantics, 9 references in your subsidiary filings. I was building toward a formal report. Last night moved my timeline up. The formal report Dana had been building became, over the next 4 days, something considerably more consequential than a pharmaceutical audit finding, and the process of building it with Marcus rather than for a filing cabinet was the process through which each of them understood what the other was actually capable of. Marcus worked from the hospital room initially, which the medical staff objected to and which he continued doing regardless, because the objections were about his health and the work was about his survival in a more complete sense than the monitors attached to his arms could measure. His laptop and phone were brought in by Reyes. His operations continued through a combination of delegation and direct involvement that maintained the Cole organization's stability during the days when news of the hospitalization had been carefully managed to prevent the kind of territorial opportunism that the Bellamy Group, the Cole organization's primary rival in the Westfield district, would have been positioned to exploit. Dana worked in the 3rd-floor research space and brought updates upstairs twice a day. She did not bring coffee or pleasantries. She brought documentation, organized in the methodical format she used for everything, with the specific elements that required Marcus's organizational knowledge flagged precisely so he could provide that context without reading everything surrounding it. You have a system, Marcus said on the 2nd day, examining the flagging structure in the document she'd placed on the bed table. I work with a lot of different clients, Dana said. Different people's attention operates differently. This format minimizes what you have to read to provide what I need. Most consultants give me everything and let me sort it, Marcus said. Most consultants are padding billable hours, Dana said. The shape of what she was building with the Walsh documentation was this. Walsh had not simply buried the Verantix 9 trial to protect a pharmaceutical client's liability exposure. He had buried it with the full understanding that the compound was functional as a targeted homicide mechanism, and he had maintained that knowledge in active use through a private arrangement with a network of clients who needed deaths that looked like natural medical deterioration. The clients included, based on Dana's analysis of the trial's post-burial communication records, which she had accessed through Miriam Park's institutional archive, at least 2 individuals with documented connections to the Bellamy Group. The Bellamy Group had been managing its territorial conflict with the Cole organization for 5 years, through a combination of financial pressure and the specific kind of targeted attrition that the group's leadership, a man named Curtis Bellamy, preferred to direct confrontation. Marcus had understood for 2 years that the attrition included individuals inside his own organization, associates who had died of health conditions that, in retrospect, shared a presenting pattern. 3, Marcus said, when Dana laid out the timeline of post-burial clients against the deaths in his organization over the corresponding period. There were 3. I thought they were a coincidence. They were spaced to look like coincidence, Dana said. Walsh was careful about the interval. He also varied the dosing, which varied the progression timeline, which prevented a pattern from being visible at the incident level. You'd only see it if you could connect the deaths to the same compound. Which required someone who knew the compound existed, Marcus said. Which required someone who'd read the trial, Dana said. Which Walsh was counting on nobody having done. She had been right and she had been the exception, and the exception was not because she was uniquely brilliant. She was careful to be honest about this with herself and with Marcus when he pressed the point. It was because she had followed a documentation thread without knowing where it led, in the same methodical way she followed every documentation thread, and the thread had happened to lead somewhere that mattered enormously. You weren't looking for this, Marcus said. I was looking for pharmaceutical contract irregularities, Dana said. This was in the same documents. Most people would have stopped at the irregularity and filed the finding, Marcus said. Most people don't read appendices, Dana said. The interesting things are usually in the appendices. The 4th day produced the first external pressure. Walsh had retained legal counsel within hours of the counteragent situation becoming formally documented, and the legal strategy Walsh's counsel had developed was the specific, preemptive strategy of someone who understood that the best defense against a disclosure process was to attack the discloser's credibility before the disclosure could be organized into an irrefutable form. Walsh's attorney contacted Cole Holdings' legal counsel with a letter alleging that Dana had accessed confidential medical records without authorization, had administered a pharmaceutical agent without medical licensure, and had caused harm to Marcus Cole's treatment through unauthorized intervention. The letter was precise, professional, and strategically timed for the moment when Dana's documentation was still being compiled. Dana received a copy from Cole Holdings' legal counsel at 3 in the afternoon, read it in the 3rd floor research space, and called Marcus at 3:12. Walsh's lawyer sent a letter, she said. I know, Marcus said. I've read it. He's trying to move faster than I can document, she said. If the hospital board receives his version before I finish compiling the trial records. How long do you need? Marcus said. 48 hours, Dana said. To compile everything. 72 to present it in a form that's irrefutable. You have 48, Marcus said. I'll manage the board timeline. You're still in a hospital bed, Dana said. I'm aware of where I am, Marcus said. I'm also aware of who sits on that board, which is more useful than the hospital bed is limiting. Do the documentation. I'll handle the timeline. She did not argue. She returned to the 3rd floor research space, opened the trial records database, and worked until 2 in the morning with the mechanical pencil tracking her annotations in the margins of printed pages, building the irrefutable version of a truth that Walsh had spent 4 years counting on nobody ever organizing. The attack, when it came, arrived through a vector Dana had identified as possible and had not fully prepared for, which was the specific failure of someone who understood risk abstractly but had not yet fully internalized that Walsh's network extended into spaces she had assumed were neutral. Her institutional database access was revoked at 9:17 in the morning on the 3rd day, by the University of Westfield's Research Compliance Office, citing an ongoing review of her institutional affiliation following a formal complaint filed by Dr. Raymond Walsh's attorney alleging misuse of research database credentials. She discovered this when a database query she'd run successfully at 9 o'clock returned an access denied error at 9:17. She sat for a moment looking at the screen. Then she called Miriam Park. "Walsh went to the university," Park said when she answered. "I've been told I'm under review for providing you with confidential trial materials." "The trial materials are part of the public research record," Dana said. "Walsh is arguing they were provided under a confidentiality arrangement that predates the trial's archival status," Park said. "It's not a strong legal argument, but it's a strong bureaucratic argument, and the compliance office responds to bureaucratic arguments faster than legal ones." "How long will the review take?" Dana said. "Weeks at minimum," Park said. "I'm sorry, Dana. I'm fighting it, but—" "I know," Dana said. "You've given me everything I needed. The documentation I have is sufficient. I just can't access the database directly anymore." "Is what you have enough?" Park said. "I'm going to find out in the next few hours," Dana said. She spent those hours conducting an inventory of everything she'd already pulled from the database before the access was revoked. The trial records, the advisory board communications, the post-burial client correspondence she'd downloaded in the previous 3 days' sessions. The inventory was, when she completed it, more complete than she'd realized in the moment of downloading it, because she had the habit of pulling more than she immediately needed on the assumption that what she didn't know she needed today she would need tomorrow. It was not complete enough to be irrefutable. It was close. The gap was a specific set of communications between Walsh and a figure in the Bellamy Group's financial structure. A man named Oliver Crane, who served as the group's legitimate business interface, that she had flagged for download and had not yet pulled when the access was cut. He called Reyes. "Walsh shut down my database access," she said. "There's a set of communications between Walsh and Oliver Crane that I need and can't retrieve." "Crane," Reyes said. "Oliver Crane. He's the Bellamy Group's financial interface," Dana said. "The communications will establish the contracted relationship directly. Without them, what I have is strong but not complete." "How are you accessing those communications?" Reyes said. "Through the trial's archival correspondence record," Dana said. "Walsh was copied on them because he was the advisory board's chair during the trial period. They're in the archive as part of his correspondence file." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Dana, are these communications in the archive because Walsh copied them, or because someone put them in the archive?" She stopped. She looked at the screen. She thought about the specific, unusual completeness of those communications, about the way they'd appeared in the archive in a format that was slightly different from the surrounding correspondence, about the specific detail that she'd noted and filed without fully examining, that the communications were flagged with a retention code that indicated they'd been preserved under a legal hold. "Someone preserved them deliberately," she said, "before the archive was sealed." "Park," Reyes said. "Park knew Walsh was going to bury the trial," Dana said, the understanding arriving in sequence. "She preserved the communications under a legal hold so they would survive the burial. She didn't tell me because she didn't know if she could trust me yet when I first contacted her." She paused. "She had them available because she wanted them to be available to the right person at the right time." "Can she release them to us directly?" Reyes said. "Walsh's attorney has put her under a compliance review," Dana said. "She can't release anything formally right now." "Informally," Reyes said. Dana thought about this for a long moment. About what informal meant in the context of a documentation process that was going to end in a hospital board presentation and a legal proceeding. About the specific fine line between preserving the chain of evidence and failing to acquire the evidence at all. "Ask Marcus," she said. "This decision has legal implications that go beyond what I should be making alone." She called Marcus directly without waiting for Reyes to relay it, because 48 hours meant 48 hours and the conversation needed to happen now. Marcus listened to her description of the situation in the specific, total silence he applied to information he was processing rather than reacting to. When she finished, he said, "What's your read on Park?" "She preserved the communications before the burial," Dana said. "She's been waiting 20 years for a situation where using them would actually change something. This is that situation." "Then she'll find a way to get them to you," Marcus said. "Not through official channels." She's been managing Walsh's obstruction for 20 years. She knows what unofficial looks like. I can't use unofficial materials in a formal proceeding, Dana said. You won't need to, Marcus said. Once Walsh understands we have the Crane communications, he's not going to force a formal proceeding. He's going to calculate whether exposure or flight is more survivable. I want to make the exposure as complete as possible before he finishes that calculation. If he chooses flight, Dana said, then we'll have documentation of a man who fled rather than face a hospital board, which is its own kind of evidence, Marcus said. You've spent 20 minutes on this problem. What's the next step? Call Park, Dana said. Tell her what we need and why. Let her decide what she's willing to do. Make the call, Marcus said. He made it. Park listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, there's a conference I'm attending in 2 weeks. I always bring paper copies of materials relevant to current research. If someone wanted to review those materials informally, they would need to be physically present. Where is the conference? Dana said. Park told her. It was 3 hours from the city. I'll be there, Dana said. The conference was in a mid-sized hotel in Caldwell, which was 3 hours northeast of the city by car and which Dana drove to alone on the 4th morning after Marcus's counteragent treatment, with her laptop bag in the passenger seat and the mechanical pencil in the cup holder and the specific, focused attention of someone who understood that what the next few hours produced would determine whether the documentation she'd been building for 3 days was complete or nearly complete, and whether nearly complete was enough. She arrived at the conference at 10:15, registered as an attendee under her own name, and found Miriam Park at the Research Methods panel discussion at 11 o'clock. Park was in her late 60s, compact and precise, with the specific unhurried energy of a woman who had been operating under pressure for so long that pressure had simply become her baseline working condition. She registered Dana's presence in the panel room with a look that communicated 2 things without words. That she had expected her and that the conversation needed to happen after the panel rather than before it. After the panel, in a hallway outside the conference room with the sound of the subsequent session beginning faintly through the closed doors, Park produced a paper folder from her conference bag. It was not labeled. It contained printed pages that were, Dana understood from the first pass, the Oliver Crane correspondence. The complete set formatted in the specific way of documents that had been preserved under a legal hold rather than casually stored, with the retention codes visible in the header of each page. This is everything, Park said. The original correspondence plus the legal hold documentation I filed when the trial was being shelved. Walsh was never told the hold existed. He believed he'd buried everything. Dana looked at the folder. She looked at Park. Why now, she said. You could have released this years ago. I could have released it to no one who would have known what to do with it, Park said. Walsh has spent 20 years managing his position. Every attempt I made to surface the trial through academic channels was absorbed. Regulatory complaints were redirected. The compound only became dangerous in the current situation because someone died. I needed someone who would recognize the compound from a symptom description and who was connected to an organization with enough weight to make the documentation move where it needed to go. You've been waiting for the right person, Dana said. I've been waiting for the right person in the right situation with the right connections, Park said. All 3 at once. It's a narrow combination. It was accidental, Dana said. I was auditing pharmaceutical contracts. I heard a hallway conversation. The best intelligence frequently is, Park said. The person who finds it isn't accidental even when the finding is. You had the knowledge. You recognized what you were hearing. You went back into the building 3 times. She paused. Dana said. Park almost smiled. I know, she said. Ray's called me this morning. The drive back to the city took 3 hours and 15 minutes with a stop for coffee and a phone call from Marcus, who asked how the conference had gone, and Dana told him precisely what she had and what she intended to do with it. It's complete, she said. The Crane correspondence plus the legal hold documentation plus everything I'd already compiled. Walsh's advisory board role, the post-burial client correspondence, the coal organization deaths that match the Verantics 9 timeline, and the contracted relationship with Oliver Crane established through the Bellamy Group's financial structure. How soon can you present it? Marcus said. I need 12 hours to integrate the new materials into the existing compilation, Dana said. I want to present it as a single complete package rather than an assembly of separate documents. Take the 12 hours, Marcus said. The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. I'll be there. You're being discharged tonight, Dana said. I know, he said. They're not happy about it. You had organ failure 4 days ago, Dana said. I'm aware of my recent medical history, Marcus said. The counteragent worked. The work ahead is more important than the hospital's discharge comfort. She thought about arguing and decided not to, because Marcus Cole making a decision about his own medical situation was a variable she did not control and because the work ahead was, in fact, more important than her comfort with his timeline. She spent the 12 hours in the third-floor research space, which she still had building access to because Walsh's administrative maneuvering had moved faster than the formal access revocation process, building the complete presentation with the same methodical precision she brought to all of it. The Crane correspondence integrated in sequence, the legal hold documentation establishing its provenance, the timeline connecting the buried trial to the Cole organization deaths to Walsh's contracted relationship with the Bellamy Group, the counteragent protocol on page 41 of the original trial documentation, the documented pattern of Walsh's misdiagnosis sitting at the center of everything, irrefutable in its completeness. She used an entire half cartridge of ink in the mechanical pencil annotating the final compilation, marking the sections that required oral explanation against the sections that were self-explanatory, sequencing the presentation in the order that built the most complete picture before asking the board to draw any conclusions. At 6 in the morning she set the pencil down on the desk surface, read through the complete compiled documentation one final time, and determined that it was accurate, complete, and organized to a standard that would withstand professional scrutiny. She called Marcus at 6:15. It's ready, she said. The hospital board meeting was held in the fourth-floor conference room of St. Clement's Administrative Wing, which was 2 floors above the ICU where Marcus had spent 4 days not dying and 3 floors above the research space where Dana had spent the same 4 days building the documentation that was now stacked in 2 organized folders on the conference table. One for the board, one for the legal representatives who had been notified of the meeting and who had arrived with a range of expressions that corresponded precisely to how much each party already understood was in those folders. Walsh arrived with his attorney. He sat at the far end of the conference table with the specific, managed composure of a man who had assessed his position and determined that composure was his best remaining strategic asset. He looked at the folders and then at Dana, who was seated beside Marcus's legal counsel with the same focused present quality she brought to every working situation. Dr. Walsh, the board chair said. You're aware of the nature of this meeting. I'm aware of the allegations, Walsh said. I want to note for the record that the materials being presented include documents obtained through unauthorized academic database access and an informal document transfer at a research conference that was not conducted through proper institutional channels. The legal hold documentation was filed by Dr. Park 19 years ago, Dana said without raising her voice. It predates the trial's archival status. The legal hold establishes the document's provenance independent of any access method. They exist in the legal record because Dr. Park preserved them in the legal record before they could be buried. Walsh's attorney said, Ms. Reeves is not a legal counsel for. She's the researcher who compiled the documentation, Marcus said, from the seat he was occupying without the hospital's enthusiasm and without any visible compromise in his capacity to be present. His voice carried the same quality it had always carried. Not loud, not aggressive, simply the voice of someone whose certainty about what they were going to say made volume irrelevant. She'll speak. The board chair looked at Walsh's attorney and then at Marcus and then made the specific institutional decision that people made when they understood which direction the weight of a room was running. Continue, Ms. Reeves. Dana presented the documentation in the sequence she had organized it. She was not performing. She was providing information in the order that produced understanding most efficiently, which was what she always did, and she did it the same way in a hospital boardroom with 12 people watching as she did it alone at a research desk at 2 in the morning. The Verantix 9 trial. The compound's mechanism. Walsh's advisory board role and his documented presence in the decision to bury the trial. The post-burial client correspondence and the Oliver Crane communications established the Bellamy Group connection. the timeline of coal organization deaths that matched the compound's characteristic progression. The misdiagnosis and the counteragent protocol Walsh had declared non-existent. Walsh interjected 4 times. The first 3 times, Dana produced the specific document that directly addressed the point he was making, and the document resolved it before his attorney could build on it. The 4th time, Marcus spoke instead of Dana, providing organizational context that established the scope of what the Bellamy Group's contracted relationship with Walsh had cost the coal organization across 5 years. By the time the presentation was complete, the board had been sitting with the materials for 47 minutes, and the room had the specific, settled quality of a space in which the relevant decision had already been made, and what remained was the formal process of recording it. Walsh was placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal investigation. His clinical privileges were suspended. The hospital's legal counsel, who had been present throughout the meeting in the specific capacity of an institution protecting itself from liability, moved with commendable speed to begin the process of separating St. Clement's formally from Walsh's professional standing. Gareth Walsh's attorney, not his hospital attorney, his private counsel, made one final attempt as the meeting was concluding, a technical argument about the chain of custody of the Crane correspondence that was legally sound and practically irrelevant, because the board had made its determination and the legal proceeding that would follow would have its own chain of custody standards that Dana had already prepared for. Walsh left the conference room without speaking again. He left with his attorney and 2 hospital security officers who had been positioned, with admirable foresight by hospital administration, to ensure that the departure was orderly. He left through the same corridor from which Dana had been escorted 4 times in a single night. She watched him leave from her seat at the conference table and felt the specific, complicated quality of a justice that was real and not quite complete and not entirely satisfying, in the way that right outcomes were sometimes not satisfying because the process of arriving at them had cost things that didn't uncost when the outcome was achieved. 3 people in Marcus's organization had died from Varantics, 9 in the years before tonight. The documentation that she'd compiled established that. The legal proceeding that followed would establish it formally. Neither the documentation nor the proceeding would bring those 3 people back. This was true, and she sat with it without resolving it, because some things did not resolve. They only became accurately understood. Marcus was beside her. He was looking at the documentation folders on the table. "You're thinking about the 3, he said. "Yes," she said. "So am I," he said. "I have been since you showed me the timeline." "Does it change what we did?" she said. "No," he said. "But it means this isn't finished. Walsh is handled. The Bellamy Group isn't." He said it with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, and it was the accurate assessment, the specific, realistic understanding that the justice available in a hospital board meeting was one kind of justice, and that other kinds were not foreclosed but were also not the work of today. "One thing at a time," Dana said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Today was the documentation. Tomorrow is the next thing." He looked at her with the specific, focused attention she had become accustomed to from him over the past 5 days. The look of a man who had learned to take accurate measurements of the things that mattered and who had arrived at a measurement he wasn't revising. "You went back 4 times, he said. "The work required it," Dana said. "The person who keeps going back in is usually the only one telling the truth," Marcus said. "I've spent 20 years learning to find that person early. I found you late. You found me when you needed to," Dana said. 6 weeks after the hospital board meeting, Dana's contract with Cole Holdings was formally restructured. The new contract gave her an expanded research mandate, direct reporting access, and a professional scope that was an accurate reflection of what she had actually been doing for the 6 months preceding the restructuring, which was, she noted to the attorney who drafted it, the most honest performance review she had ever received, even though it arrived in contract language rather than feedback form. She kept the 3rd-floor research space. She had been offered a different office. Larger, better positioned, the kind of space that was offered to people whose status had been formally upgraded, and she had declined it on the grounds that the 3rd-floor space was the space where she had built the documentation that mattered, and she saw no reason to displace a working system for the sake of a symbolic upgrade. The mechanical pencil was still in the cup holder on her desk, beside the printed pages of whatever she was currently annotating. She went through approximately 1 cartridge a week. Walsh's formal investigation was proceeding through the appropriate channels, which was slower than the hospital board meeting had been and considerably more robust in its legal structure. The Crane communications and the legal hold documentation had been formally introduced through a process that, as Marcus had anticipated, Walsh had decided not to contest, because contesting the documentation would require Walsh to engage with its contents in a forum where engaging with its contents was worse than the alternative. Oliver Crane, whose name had appeared in the documents, was the subject of a separate investigation that had been initiated by a law enforcement referral from the Cole organization's legal counsel. This investigation was moving at the pace that such investigations moved, which was not the pace of a hospital board meeting but the pace of a process building toward something that would last. The Bellamy Group had not yet been formally connected to Walsh's contracted relationship with the specificity that Marcus's organization was building toward. This was the unresolved thread. It was working. Dana was working part of it. The pharmaceutical contract dimension, the financial structure through which Walsh's payments had been routed, the specific documentation of the Bellamy Group's use of Verantix 9 that was distinct from Walsh's documentation but that connected to it in ways she was mapping with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Marcus came to the third-floor research space twice a week, which was more often than any client had visited her working space in 11 years of freelance research work, and which she had initially categorized as a function of the ongoing investigation and had subsequently, with the same honest assessment she applied to everything, recategorized more accurately. He sat in the chair she kept beside the desk, which had migrated from a storage function to a consistent use function somewhere in the third week of the investigation, and he asked questions about the current phase of the research the way he asked questions about everything, specifically with genuine interest, expecting and receiving precise answers. "The Crane financial structure," he said on a Tuesday in the fifth week. "The routing you identified last week. Does it connect to the Bellamy Group's Thornfield District operation or to the central structure?" "The Thornfield operation," Dana said. Which is interesting because the Thornfield operation was established 2 years before Walsh's first documented Cole organization client, which means the financial channel existed before the specific contract. They built the infrastructure first and then found the use for it. Which means the Walsh arrangement was not opportunistic, Marcus said. "It was planned," Dana said. "They identified Walsh as a potential resource, built the financial structure to work with him, and then waited for the right situation to deploy him. The Cole organization wasn't the first deployment. There are 3 prior clients in the Crane correspondence who I haven't been able to identify by name yet but whose payment structure matches." 3 more, Marcus said. "At minimum," Dana said. "I'll have names by the end of the week if the financial tracing holds." He looked at the annotated pages on her desk with the specific focused attention he gave to information that was going to produce consequential decisions. Then he looked at her. "Dana," he said. She looked up from the page. "What you built in those 4 days," he said. "The documentation. The hospital board. The Crane correspondence. I've had researchers, analysts, and professional investigators working for my organization for 20 years. None of them would have recognized the compound from a hallway conversation. I spent 3 years on that trial," Dana said. "None of them would have gone back in 4 times, he said. "The work required it," she said, which was what she'd said the first time he'd made this observation, because it was still true and still the accurate answer. "I know," he said. "That's the point. The work required it and you did it. Most people determine what a situation requires and then decide whether that level of requirement suits them. You determined what the situation required and treated the gap between your current position and the requirement as a logistics problem." He thought about this. "That's how research works," she said. "That's how very few things work," Marcus said. "In my experience." She held his look for a moment and then returned to the annotated page, because the annotation was the work and the work was always the most honest available response to any situation. The person they keep escorting out is often the only one telling the truth. She had thought this about herself sometimes across 11 years of working in institutions that valued credentials they'd decided on before she arrived. She had thought it that night in the hospital hallway, being walked back through the lobby by Gerald for the 3rd time while a man 4 floors above her was dying from something she knew how to stop. She had not said it aloud. She had simply gone back in. That was, she had come to understand the whole of it. The work required it and she was the person who was going to do the work. And the 4 times she went back in were not separate acts of courage but a single continuous act of doing what the situation required. The people who kept being underestimated, she thought, were not the ones who eventually fought to be seen. They were the ones who simply kept doing the work until the work made the argument for them. If this story held you from the first corridor to the last office, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and come back to the Westfield district because the Bellamy Group's connection to Walsh is still being traced, and some investigations take longer than a single night to complete. Drop a comment. Do you think Walsh deserves prison, professional ruin, or something more? And does the answer change when you consider how long he operated undetected?